And we have made our way to the month of February, which actually means we're beginning our first topic.
Now we're going to start reading prophets as prophets.
Yeah. So let's say a quick word about your Bible reading schedule. I hope everyone has one of these. In February, you see it divided into 4 weeks, the 4th through the 10th, 11th through the 17th, 18th through 24. And then notice 25 through March the 2nd. That's what that wording means there, if any of that's confusing to you. And at the very bottom of it, you'll notice that Amos is our prophet that we're reading. So we have two kinds of reading going on. Reading that pertains to our big idea, God's control over history. We're looking at these prophetic themes. And then as well, reading, if you want more reading, in the prophets. So Amos will be our prophet this month. So let's start with the theme, God's control over history. That's not a prophet theme. That's a biblical theme.
That's a biblical theme that the prophets in particular, you have to keep calling the people back to, just like we need to. I mean, let's be honed, we need to be called back to.
I heard someone say that in a sermon recently. That's where I picked it up.
Yeah, that's good for you. I'm glad you were listening. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It is a biblical theme, but because we do tend to get focused on the tumult around us, current events that depress us or frighten us or whatever. We need to be reminded of this, and that's why the prophets were often reminding people. And the other part of it is part of why I think people fall into certain kinds of sin. Kind of a prophetic angle here. We don't take seriously the fact that God is running things. If we really believe that God is in control and the outcome is certain, I think there's a little more moral motivation to stay on the straight and narrow.
So one of the things that I think is cool about this theme in the prophetic period is that we actually see God moving the chess pieces on the board.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, like for us, at least from appearance's sake, the chess pieces are static. They're just kind of staying where they are.
Yeah, history's history now.
Yes, but during that time, I mean, Babylon was coming, right?
Yeah.
Or Assyria. The armies were marching on them. Those were so the chess pieces are actually moving, and the prophets are often working in a time where the events are just getting ready to happen, and then are happening or in the aftermath of it. So the idea that God is at work would have been like real in the moment for them. They could see what was going on.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So part of the prophet's motivation again, and calling them back to this can be anything from building faith to calling them to trust. Get rid of your anxiety, your fear. In some cases, like in the book of Jeremiah, just submission. The Babylonian invasion is God's will, God's just punishment for your sin, and so part of your now acknowledgement of sin is submit to the judgment. So but ultimately, all of this goes back to just one simple fact: God is in control of the movements of history. No matter how much you think a particular ruler or military leader or whatever is responsible for the victories, the conquests, the policies, whatever, the Bible says ultimately at the ultimate level, God knows and God is in control.
So the reading for week 1, this is February 4 through 10, comes to us from Isaiah 44, toward the back half of 44 and into 45. I'm sure this is going to be another chapter break Jeff doesn't like. Always. And so it focuses on one of those characters. So you're giving us an opportunity to actually look at a specific example of God working in history.
Yeah. So part of the power of what we're going to read this week is you got to remember Isaiah is alive and prophesying, inspired by God to prophesy. Ballpark, 150, 170 years before the coming of Cyrus, who's named by name in this passage. And so
who is Cyrus? Let's help our people out who may not know.
Cyrus is going to be the first great leader of the Medo-Persian Empire, the empire that's coming to conquer Babylon. But what's powerful about this is in Isaiah's day, Babylon's not even an empire itself yet.
Right.
Assyria is the empire. So Isaiah, God through Isaiah, is telling the future, naming men whose great-grandparents haven't even been born yet, but calling Cyrus by name. Cyrus's great-grandparents aren't even around yet. And again, for prophesying the rise of an empire, this is the empire after the empire of the current empire. I mean, and the reason God is doing this, he makes clear the larger context of this section of Isaiah, is No other God does this, calls it this far in advance with this level of detail. Nobody does this. That's why you know I am the one true God. And that's why you really know I truly have control over history. Because eventually, for people who were reading Isaiah 2 centuries later, for whom eventually Cyrus would not be future, but would be the past, they look and say, wow, our God really does know what he's doing. So God is kind of laying down some benchmarks so that his people can eventually come to a greater faith in him, that he really is running things.
Yeah, Cyrus is going to be the guy that allows them to leave captivity.
Yeah.
So think about the complication there. One empire takes them into captivity, the Babylonians.
Right.
And what God says is going to be a whole nother empire.
That's right.
That will come along, and a different leader who is going to let them go free.
That's right. And so part of the power along that line, David, is the terminology that God uses for Cyrus there. Literally the last verse of chapter 44, he calls Cyrus my shepherd. In the first verse of chapter 45, God calls Cyrus his anointed, which is in Hebrew Messiah, Mashiach. And so, part of this, where you kind of get into, God works on multiple levels here. Cyrus being the great king who leads or allows God's people to go leave captivity and go rebuild Jerusalem and the temple and begin worshiping God in his holy city again, is a type of the ultimate Messiah who releases God's people from the captivity of sin and in a sense builds the eternal city of God and the true temple of God, the church, and there, and thus allows God's true people, spiritually speaking, spiritual Israel, Christians, the church, to go and worship God forever. So again, God uses a down payment in history as the anticipation of his ultimate control of history. God's kind of, working on multiple levels here. It's an amazing thing, and God says, all this is so that you will have a greater faith in me. I am in complete control of what's happening on the earth.
Yeah, and so one of the things we read again and again in the prophets is this idea that God is running the show, whether it be I'm going to bring judgment against you, or whether it be I'm going to provide deliverance for you, or this empire or that, or one of the surrounding nations. I'm going to deal with the Philistines or whoever. God is the one that's ultimately determining the rise and fall of these nations, which demonstrates he is the one true God who runs history, which ought to be a source of consolation to us.
Absolutely.
And yet it's not. We fret so much. I mean, come on. Okay, it's February, and how many of you are thinking about November, right? There's an election coming up. We're voting on president.
Season coming up. We got primary season. Not even going to leave us alone.
And that even a lot of Christians are just sitting here thinking everything rides
on the important election in our lifetime
and on the outcome of this election. Yeah, how many times have y'all heard that?
Yeah.
You think eventually, once you've lived 60 years and you heard that every election cycle, you would pick up on the fact that, elections really are not all that consequential.
Yeah.
And besides, we have very little control over the outcome of that, except we do have a direct channel to the one who does run the show. And you think we'd have greater faith and confidence that whatever happens, it'll be okay, because our God still reigns.
That's right. And that he is working the actual, he's working the eternal good of his own people. Just like in this passage about Cyrus, what God is literally saying is these world events, the coming and going of empires, ultimately are going to be for the benefit of this small little Judean remnant to go back to this small podunk ruin of Jerusalem and rebuild the city of God where his name dwells and the temple where he is to be worshipped. And so, believe it or not, in all the comings and goings of all the great names and great empires, it's really about God keeping an eye on his people and accomplishing his purposes for his people. And so again, let not your heart be troubled, even if times get hard for a while, because they got hard for the Jews. At the end of the day, God is working about a far greater salvation for his people.
As insignificant as they would have been on the world stage at that time.
And that's the thing, when you read the worldly histories of that era, either written by the Persians themselves to modern world history textbooks, the return of the Jews to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple is not a thing. And yet in the Bible, God says the coming and going of nations, is really about me setting up the field so that my people's purposes can be accomplished.
So let's circle back to the reading for this week in Isaiah. The goal is for us to see a specific example of how God is demonstrating himself to be the God who controls history, right? And that'll be the theme we're looking for all month in the February reading. So be thinking about that. God is the one who controls history as we work through these different readings in February. Now, we're also reading as a supplement the book of Amos, who is my favorite minor prophet.
It's a good one.
Just a quick word about Amos, maybe a quick background.
Okay, quick background on Amos. Amos
He's a southern preacher sent to the north.
You're done. That's the thing. And most famously, he's not a professional prophet. In fact, he makes that point in chapter 7 of his book.
He feels like a Texas preacher sent to preach in New York.
Oh, yeah. Except that even then, he was just an intern before that. Man, he wouldn't even do this full time. He was literally a farmer. He was a farmer in the southern kingdom of Judah, called by God to go to the northern kingdom. This is before Amos's lifetime, is before the northern kingdom falls to the Assyrians, to go and warn the northern kingdom. And so he does, and then goes back home, as far as we know, and disappears from history, literally just for one very limited purpose, which was to go and to prophesy against, in particular, against the golden calf worship. Famously has a confrontation in Bethel, which was one of the cities in the northern kingdom where, remember, Jeroboam in the kingdom first splits, sets up idolatrous golden calf worship. Amos goes there in particular. Chapter 7 has a face on face with a false priest, false prophet there named Azariah, and and basically says, "I was just a farmer, man. I'm not in this for the money. I am sent here by God to tell you to knock it off. Judgment's coming."
But boy, the country boy really comes out when you read it. When you read Amos, think about country boy, and you see that in the illustrations that he uses, and, and the sometimes graphic language. But another thing to watch for, in the first couple of chapters, I think we see at least a little hint of this idea that God controls history, because we read about the nations, and God is saying, I'm going to step in and deal with this nation and this nation and this nation. He sees what they've done, and he's going to deal with them because he is the Lord over all the earth. And so that's kind of there in those early chapters.
Well, and then even taking a step further, we're talking about God's control, God's absolute control over things. Part of what he's going to say repeatedly in those early chapters of Amos is, hey, that famine, that drought, and so forth, things that you just chalked up to, bad weather or a bad year or these things happen. God's saying, actually, no, that was my attempt to get your attention, through hard times, draw you back to me and focusing on me and repenting of your sin, rather than just seeing it as, well, it's just, droughts happen.
You didn't return to me.
And yet you did not return to me becomes the refrain over and over. But again, all of it goes back to those headlines in the newspaper, drought enters 6th month or whatever. God's point is really, you need to look beyond the headlines and look to me and realize maybe, just maybe, when everybody's having a bad time, I'm really wanting you to focus on me again and renew your heart and your commitment to me.
That's exactly right. So even as you read Amos this week, you can ponder this bigger idea that God is the God who is over all the world. God is the God who rules over history. And even in the prophet Amos, I think we see that same theme at work. Next week, we'll pick up that discussion. Hope you'll come back. Hope you enjoy your reading this week.